I lost 500,000 or more on one property once, and that was when I really learned my lesson. I didn't even think this industry was worth spending time on until 2017. That was when I realized design is probably the most important thing. And now, if you create a listing that isn't designed to get to the top of that ladder of supply, you're really just shooting yourself in the foot.
People are in one of two extremes. They either think, okay, let's just be the best in the OTAs. I'm just gonna play by their rules. And then there's those that are on the extreme of like, Airbnb is not my friend.
So you don't need to go direct. I did Airbnb only until I broke 100 doors, just to prove that you could do that.
Think about that concept of leverage. I'm curious to know what it means to you.
I think this is probably a universal problem for business owners.
Do you think that arbitrage is still the business model that you would have chosen to start your journey in this industry if you knew what you know today?
One last nugget for people who listen to this who are just straight business people.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Hospitality Edge podcast, where we bring together what we think are two sides of the same coin, real estate and hospitality, and really where we bring here leaders, operators, entrepreneurs, investors, and founders in the vacation rental and hospitality space so they can tell us about their stories and the lessons that they have learned along the way, as well as some of the mistakes that they might have made along the way so we can avoid making those same mistakes ourselves. Today, I'm super excited to welcome Sean. I'm not the best at spelling, pronunciation, last names, but Sean Rakidzich, he is a true industry icon. He's a creator of Airbnb Automated, a YouTube channel with almost 300,000 subscribers, with more than 1,000 videos. And he's taught, countless hosts and operators how to scale their business through a business model like rental arbitrage and co-hosting. He has also built an arbitrage empire himself. He has consulted real estate investment trusts. He manages a diverse portfolio of single family, multifamily, as well as larger vacation rental properties. And in this episode, we'll be trying to cover a lot from the post-COVID rental boom to balancing supply with quality, the power of design to stand out in today's competitive environment, as well as discuss best practices for hosts. So no matter whether you're a beginning or a seasoned host, I think that Sean's expertise will inspire you to think bigger. So thank you so much, Sean, for taking the time to be here with us today. How are you doing?
Hey, I'm doing great. Thanks for having me. And thanks for
Yes,
the
absolutely.
introduction. The last name is tough. It's Serbian. It's Rakidzich, but you were really close.
Rakidzich. Okay, I tried. So, Sean, let's start with before we get into the timeline of your story. Tell us, if you were to start all over again, right? So no connections. You didn't have the empire that you have built up until now, but you had the knowledge, and you could change something from the way you build things. What, if anything, would you do differently if you had to start in this business all over again?
Well, now 10 years after doing it the first time, the industry's changed a ton. Um, if I started back then 10 years ago, there'd be things I'd change. Even, starting again 10 years ago. I think when I first started, the thing that I did right is I did not look at it like a real estate thing. I looked at it for what it was on its face, which was, serving someone a product and a service at the same time. Short-term rentals is both a product and a service. And it was a lot about unit utilization, like taking apartments and having, nights free and finding a way to sell those individual nights. And every night was its own product. That I did right, but my design was terrible. I was basically a 27-ish-year-old man who never did any real estate interior design, and my places looked like it. So right away, I think I would have changed like how I made my products. I would have actually made them more of a hospitality product. Something with its own value proposition instead of just having these apartments available. But I think I got lucky because 2014, there was no competition. But now, in 2024, I would focus on finding properties that are obviously underserviced, because there's so much property on Airbnb now. You can see what people are buying, what people like, and you can find gaps in the market because everything's much more well-defined. And so I would look first, find a gap, and pick a product and design it perfectly to serve the gap. Now that I know a lot about business, it's actually easier now. 10 years ago, I don't think I was capable of doing that. But now, yeah, I definitely have a design first approach. and I'd be really conscious of product market fit.
And when it comes to that design first approach, um, I'm curious to know your thoughts on best practices around how to do that, because it can sound as something that is subjective. However, you're a very analytical guy, so I'm sure that there must be a framework, or a process that you go through to try to differentiate what is design that will actually move the needle in terms of helping you differentiate yourself and earn more with your property, versus design that might not actually end up making any kind of difference. So how do you look at that?
Let me ask, what's your favorite color?
Red.
Okay, red's your favorite color. And if you found a cool looking red Airbnb, do you think you'd be more prone to picking it because red's your favorite color?
That's a good question. Perhaps. I'm not too
Yeah,
sure.
the
Sounds subjective.
perhaps is perhaps is good enough, right? For this example, the hypothetical of there's people that like red, and they might like red enough to book a red place. But when you look at all the Airbnbs online, there's so few red properties, right? I mean, this is a theater room. Red in a theater room makes a lot of sense, very AMC. But for the whole home, like that's people aren't really that brave usually. There's a lot of properties like white, beige, light gray, blue. You get a lot of the neutrals. One of my most recent properties I did is completely orange, like tangerine. And the reason why I picked that is when I was in newspaper sales, I was 22 years old, 21, 22. And back then, of course, in Wisconsin, if you're 21 or 22, you probably drink and you go out to bars and you drink. And in Milwaukee, there was a there was a club or a bar, I can't remember the name of it, but they had a basement that was actually the name of the place was called Tangerine, and the basement was completely tangerine colored, all the furniture, wall to ceiling, everything. And it's one of the most memorable rooms I ever stood in. And when I made this new space, I'm like, you know what? I'm going to try that out. I'm going to make a tangerine colored Airbnb because nobody did it, right? There's not a single one in Dallas Fort Worth that's orange. And it's performed really, really well because even though tangerine, like that orange color, isn't something people would normally pick, that they don't normally look for, there's nobody giving that type of experience or that type of look. So the supply demand curve for that nuance doesn't exist. I'm the only one. So it was a swing of the bat to create a one of one property. And so if somebody did, a red themed property, they might be one of very few properties in whatever major city you're looking for. And that resets the supply and demand curve, not just for total Airbnb listings, but for listings of a certain flavor that would be fun to stay in, right? So the red property might compete with, I don't know, there might be some other stuff that's a little bit more tongue in cheek. There might be some stuff that's just really powerful and maybe more neutral still, but with good furniture. But you end up in a very small list of properties that people are considering when you break away from the norm. So that design first approach really is to cut through white noise, just like videos, right? I've been a YouTuber right for 8 years now. The beginning of a video, I guess, is so important, and I've really never considered what it takes to create a good video intro. I just normally just speak value and hope it works out. But there's a lot of creators out there that can make a very information light video where they don't teach much, but because their intro was so perfectly phrased, they get everybody to stick around the first 30 seconds, and that's what YouTube cares about. It's that same kind of concept. There's thousands and thousands of videos people can watch, including this podcast. How and why they click on it is like engineered down to a science. And Airbnb is the same way. Your thumbnail is the one most important part of whether somebody's going to click on your listing. And picking a color that people like but is underrepresented is one of those fast ways to get to the top.
hmm That's interesting. And you mentioned that, of course, when you started, you were 27 years old. You looked at it mostly through the lenses of okay, this is a real estate, move, or business model or whatever. The design wasn't really a factor that you were trying to optimize for. One of the reasons being there was not a lot of competition back then, whereas now there's a lot more competition, so you have to stand out. When when in your career did you start to have this realization? Was it something that came progressively, or was there something that happened that made you completely make that shift into a design first approach?
Yeah, I think I lost. like 500,000 or more on one property once, and that was when I really learned my lesson. Um, there's been a lot of realizations in 10 years. The first realization, I didn't even think this industry was worth spending time on until 2017. I was hosting for 2 years and didn't even think that this was gonna be something to invest in. I was too busy with another company thinking that I could redefine the newspaper industry, but the Super Bowl came to Houston in 2017, and the news was saying that people are gonna charge $1,000 a night for their homes, and that's when that clicked. I'm like, "Oh, there's a lot of money in this." And so 2017 on is when I started to build my portfolio. And after COVID, we did a deal where we picked up 40 apartments, 40, on the west side of Houston on the way to Katy. And I had automated my business at that point, and I had a person running the whole company, and we had about $1 million in cash that we could burn on doing some stuff. So we picked up 40 doors, and my team, my fault for not teaching them well enough at this time, but my team just did whatever they thought they should, and they wanted to save money. They're very operations forward. So their goal was just to save the most money on launching these 40 doors. So all 40 looked the same and they were ugly, right? And so out of these 40 doors, we'd have about 5 of them booked on average. So we oversaturated a section of West Houston with product that nobody wanted. And we just not only did we burn, nearly $200,000 on entry on the furniture we did buy, but then we started to burn, if we weren't even profitable on the 5 that were getting booked. So, we probably were burning $70,000 a month in operational expense negative on that property. And by the time we got away from that property, we were probably in for more than a $500,000 by the time we cut our losses on that series of doors. And that's when I realized that you just can't have units. Like the units don't make money just because they're units. Units have to have a value proposition worth clicking on. And yeah, so it was an expensive loss, but that was when I realized design is probably the most important thing now, post COVID, because is just so much relevant supply that if you create a listing that isn't designed to get to the top of that ladder of supply, you're really just shooting yourself in the foot.
That's very interesting. Now you touch on something else, which is, of course, kind of the risk that comes with the business model that you decided to start with and that you scaled with, which is arbitrage. So I wanna hear your thoughts on the business model of arbitrage, and when you look at arbitrage versus co-hosting, property management, call it however you want to call it. Do you think that arbitrage is still the business model that you would have chosen to start your journey in this industry if you knew what you know today, of both the upside but the
Well,
risks that come with it?
right now, absolutely yes. Um, if I could see the future, right? Pre-COVID, I would have tried to buy property pre-COVID if I could see the future because of the dilution of cash from our stimulus plan to try to survive COVID. Property values doubled. If you knew property values were going to double, you should be buying property, right? If you saw that black swan event coming. But that aside, after this, bull run in the real estate market, where we are now, the cost to get into a property, also considering how competitive the industry is, everything else, arbitrage might be the only realistic way to get in without spending a ton of money. Because co-hosting, there's a lot of co-hosts. I co-host now, and if you wanted to start a business, you'd be competing directly with me and thousands of other hosts that have a brand. How do you get somebody to trust you with a property when you don't have one? Right? You've never done Airbnb before. Who's going to trust you where you're saying, I'm not going to pay you any rent. I'm going to make you buy this furniture and I'm going to run it as some expert that I'm not. Co-hosting requires a lot of trust. So you have to have at least one property. And that's what I teach my students. Get one at least first. Whether you buy it or arbitrage, you can create a product. And that is your case study in which you can pitch co-hosting. So the answer is, do you buy or do you arbitrage first? Because co-hosting really isn't a reasonable option for a starter. And then from there, you can do your mix, arbitrage, owning, co-hosting. I think you should always have a mix of co-hosting because it changes the way the cash flows and what your net operating income is for your entire business and stuff like that. But versus owning, I think versus owning, I think arbitrage really is the best way to get started now because it's expensive to buy a property right now. And arbitrage allows you more range. You can do small properties, you can still do houses. You can do them pretty much anywhere. And really, all you have to do is find a landlord who is hurting enough in his pocketbook to consider taking you instead of a regular long-term tenant. And that's really easy to find, I find. So,
Very interesting. So, can you please take us back to when you were 27 years old and you got into this space, and just tell us a little bit about how it came about? Like, what were you doing back then? You mentioned you were working in the newspaper industry. How did you come across this sector, and a little bit about the timeline of how you got started?
yeah. So necessity is the mother of invention, right? So necessity is the mother of invention would be the theme for my 27s, right? So I was some naive big shot newspaper consultant, right? Naive big shot. I started a business that was building sales teams for newspapers that were helping them with what we call audience development, getting people to take subscriptions at home. And I was making seven figures a year in the newspaper industry, which, is a tall order, right? Newspapers have been dying for a long time. And it's really hard to pull off. So I thought I was pretty cool. And at that time, I was trying to come up with new ways to hire new salespeople and, kind of press the envelope. I was learning to write software. I had learned to write like PHP, JavaScript, and do what's called an Ajax call so I could create web apps for my sales guys to be able to do online orders through like a tablet. I'm trying to do all this stuff. And one of the things I did was I started renting apartments and furnishing them. And then I would recruit sales guys from different cities like LA or somewhere like Detroit, Michigan, or wherever. And I'd say, move to Houston and work for me. I'll give you a free place to stay for 2 months. And you could just work and you kind of figure out if you want to stay with my company. And so I was giving people corporate housing as a way to give them a fringe benefit to relocate. I was trying to take away the what do I do when I get there part. And that worked. I recruited some really good people and we made a lot of money. But that aside, I signed year-long leases, only needing them 2 months at a time. So at one point, I had three empty apartments. Well, the one that I was living in from time to time, but I had a girlfriend, so we'd be at her place a lot. And then my two other apartments that I had for my employees. And so at one point, I just was paying rent for three apartments that I really didn't need. And I was out somewhere in Houston, probably Midtown Houston, and one of my friends stated that she went and stayed at an Airbnb for Memorial Day weekend or Labor Day weekend or something, whatever one comes later before October. And that's when I discovered what Airbnb was, and I asked her, of course, "What is that? What do you mean?" And then two and two just clicked together, and I immediately put these apartments on Airbnb, and they immediately started making money. So I had three apartments on Airbnb where my rents were just under $6,000, including like my utilities, and then my revenue was just over $12,000. So I was making like $6,000 profit a month immediately. The last month of 2014, going into 2015. And it was just sheerly out of necessity to not lose money on these units. And that's why my approach to Airbnb has never been real estate, right? I don't care what the property's worth. I don't care what it's going to be worth next year when it's arbitrage. Um, it was just, I've got my hands on something that I can sell and I need to sell it at a profit.
hmm Okay, makes sense. Now, when you start kind of seeing that this is something that has potential, what's the first, let's call it, bottleneck that you hit, or the first obstacle to scalability that you faced when you were aiming to start growing your arbitrage portfolio? You talk about certain phases of growth that hosts tend to go through. What was your first, so to speak, roadblock or bottleneck where you were faced with kind of a decision of having to change something within the way you were doing things if you wanted to continue being able to scale to the
Mm.
next stage?
Yeah, I think this is probably a universal problem for business owners, this concept of leverage. Most people think of leverage as debt, right? That's it. But workforce leverage is a real leverage, right? And at one point, I was doing housekeeping on my units, and after the Super Bowl, I had 10 doors, and it was at around that point that I could not clean all of my own apartments by myself. One day on a Sunday, we might have 7 apartments in 3 different buildings, and there's no way I could clean them all. So I had to start hiring housekeepers, and hiring one or two, not a big deal, right? And that wasn't a real challenge, but it was just the first realization that I've got to start leveraging other people. It was about 30 doors that I was running a team of maybe 5 or 6 housekeepers, and it was still just me, and the issue that really hurt was being available until 3 AM sometimes, because at 30 doors, people would check in late, they would have issues with their key at, like, 1:30 in the morning, and at one point, I just started to burn out. My patience for people was going away. So at about the 30, 35 door mark, I needed to hire somebody else who didn't wanna strangle their guests because they were just burned out from dealing with guests so much. So I hired my first leadership role in the company to take some of the days of the week where I could actually have some freedom again. And we then hired a remote assistant person to do some like night shift work as well for that manager. So she didn't have to be awake till 2 a.m. that many days of the week either. And we started to build what looked like a real org chart at about 35 doors. That was that's the bottleneck that I felt the most that I needed to solve.
Mhm. And how did you think about that concept of leverage? I'm also a big fan of that concept, but I'm curious to know what it means to you. What are the different ways in which a business owner can build leverage within their operation, and how did you get to that realization that that leverage is what you needed to get through that first bottleneck?
Yeah, so a few examples plus a word of caution. The word of caution first. I had a girlfriend whose father was like the lead architect for Methodist Hospital, and he once said, "You never let accounting, sales, and operations in the same room at the same time." Right? You never let them commune because the 3 could cut you out as a company. You really don't want them touching together. If accounting and sales got together, they could retrofit enough stuff to like maybe commit fraud or whatever. If the sales and operations got together, they could retrofit and commit fraud or maybe start a new offshoot of a company. So when you leverage people, you also need to separate the specializations of them. That's the main word of caution. Don't give away all of your power when you leverage. But examples of leverage. My newspaper industry, I knew how to sell people, very quick sale, 30-second rapport, 1 minute presentation, 2 minute closing cycle. Within 5 minutes, I could make a sale that a newspaper would pay me $100. And then I could give a commission to somebody to do the same thing, and I pay them like say 40 or 45, right? And I get to keep another chunk of it. So all I had to do was uh, make the rest of the job simple enough where I would find sales locations, whatever. I'd provide sales training. I would control all the complexities of the company, and then I would train racehorses to do this one thing that actually generated the revenue. And so I had leveraged at one point about 30 or 40 sales guys that were selling subscriptions where they would make 60 or $100 at a time according to newspaper commissions, but they would get their paid 15 to $50 at a time, right? And so that's a version of leveraging sales teams where now instead of you just putting in 8 hours of labor yourself, you've got teams putting in 200 hours of labor a day where they're generating commissions. That's one example. TopTal did an arbitrage play. TopTal utilized Odesk and Upwork, if you know what those are, where you can like hire like freelancers. They interviewed all of the software engineers on Upwork and found like the best 1 or 2% of them and then got them into like these agreements where they would go to them for contracts at a really good rate, but then would sell that curated group of engineers to like Silicon Valley at $120 an hour. So they would get these huge contracts that they would manage. Like they had the expertise in the middle, like they knew Agile or whatever, right? Or Scrum or something. And they would manage these guys, but they were leveraging an existing talent base and just curated a talent base and sold it to Silicon Valley at like 4 or 5x of what they were paying at least. And that company just grew neck break size, right? So that's another version of leverage. You can leverage people to increase your throughput for time in pretty much any industry just the same way. Um, you can have what's another good one? You can have brand ambassadors canvas and grow a company really, really fast. So, for example, Uber, when they launched, they went around and had people try to sign up drivers, right? So when you have a market share grab for a startup company like Uber versus Lyft, they are trying to get drivers on their app as fast as possible so they could get to scale. So they took brand ambassadors and just sent them city to city to sign up drivers in high value cities where they wanted to get a certain saturation. And it wasn't just about the throughput for time, like my sales team. They actually needed to put in a certain amount of time total, but get it compressed so they can get to market faster. So you can leverage people to get to market faster, or you can leverage people just to have operational volume. Those are two completely different things. One is um,
Mhm.
one is a project where you want to get something done in a very near timeline, and one is operations. But the concept of leverage applies to both, but with like I guess different best practices.
I love that. I love that. And again, I'm so passionate about leverage. We talk about it a lot on the show. There's this book you might have heard of, The Almanac of Naval Ravikant, this venture capitalist that talks about what he thinks are the four types of leverage. In his words, it's, talent is one of them. Of course, you can hire someone to do a certain function, whether it's operational or in terms of go to market, like you just explained. Then you have you know code or technology, right? You can leverage tools or even develop your own and essentially gain leverage in such a way. You can have media, right? You can do content like you do, or basically record SOPs and things of that nature, so that the piece of video is there and you don't have to be spending time training each new hire. It happens kind of automatically. And so there's talent, and then of course there's capital, right, as a fourth uh, you know l- way of leverage. So what I find interesting about everything that you're saying when it comes to leverage is that you gave a few examples about talent, right, as a form of leverage. And you talked about the first person that you brought on as a leader, right? You brought on this leader within your company. What mistake do you see hosts or operators make when they're trying to start leveraging people for the first time, when they're first going and going through that transition of being sort of solopreneurs to now becoming, let's call it, leaders, where they have teams and whatnot? What would you say is the main mistake you see when people are trying to go through that transition?
I think there's actually two, depending on the type of person. Um, and actually, I want to touch on the leverage thing. One last nugget for people who listen to this who are just straight business people. The four you just mentioned are all versions of time leverage, if you think about it, because you are called it's called the time value of money, right? Money in the future is worth less. So the more we can apply today, we can get leverage versus the time value of money. But what's interesting too is the go to market one is actually force leverage. It's not just time leverage where you get more money to work over time, or you get a machine that can duplicate something faster, which is of course time leverage, or media where one video can be seen 1,000 times at the same time. That's again time leverage. These are all time leverages, but you can also have force leverage. So the need to go to market quickly, um, or the need to saturate an audience with ideas. Media and talent both can be used to leverage through force, where you couldn't get something accomplished unless you got past a certain amount of inertia, right? And ideas or information has a certain amount of inertia because there's so much information on the internet. If you wanted everyone to adopt an idea, you'd have to have that idea hit the market with so much force that enough people are going to talk about it at the same time that it actually sticks. So the four types of leverage can be defined by both time leverage and force leverage. I just wanted to put that out there, just a novel thought.
Mhm.
And now, these two mistakes that people make when they try to leverage, one is the need for perfect duplication. People think that somebody's going to be like a duplicate paper copy of themselves. And this is where most owners get really heartbroken to find that their employees don't care nearly as much as they do, right? And they're just there for their job. So the expectation of duplication is one that people make a mistake on. And the other one is like absentee landlordism, right? Where like, hey, do this and they go and they don't actually prepare the person at all. They just expect somebody to kind of know what they're doing, right? And so there's a negligent form of leverage, and then there's the like naive form of leverage, which is you expect somebody to get up to your standard and you over rely upon that person. Even though you put in work to make them good at their job, you over depend on somebody because you expect them to care as much as you do. Those are the main ones. So you can have people kind of do the helicopter micromanager approach where they hover over people because they're worried that the person doesn't do their job. and that person starts to feel like dejected and controlled, and they'll leave the company. And all of these mistakes turn to some form of disengagement, right? So no matter what your mistake is, whether you hover over somebody or you're negligent or whatever, the person won't like their work anymore and they'll leave. And usually on the way out, they'll do a lot of damage. So there's a book called Who, A Method for Hiring, that talks a lot about the cost of hiring the wrong people and talks about like that cycle of like disengagement. But then there's a book called Multipliers by Liz Wiseman that I like a lot. That if you want to get like a lot out of people and make them really good, Multipliers is a great book for leaders who want to prevent that disengagement cycle.
Thanks for sharing those recommendations. So who and multiplier. So if we look at those two extremes, right, of leveraging talent, on one extreme, you you simply hire that person, you tell them this is what needs to get done, and then you just let that person run with it, never talk to that person ever again, don't check, don't do any kind of micromanagement. They just they have the task, and now we trust that they can execute on it. The other extreme, of course, is a lot of micromanagement, to an extreme where the person might end up leaving, right, because they feel like they're being too micromanaged. How do you find that sweet spot? Do you think it's dependent on functions and roles? And so, for example, an operational role, you'll have to have more checks and balances, and therefore play more of a micromanager type role versus a leader. In another department, you might be able to let that person have a little bit more of space. Do you think it comes down to kind of where you're at as a leader, and also the seniority of the talent that you're bringing on? Do you think micromanagement is actually as bad as we have now kind of made it sound in the in corporate America? Like, what are your thoughts on where you draw that line in terms of too much oversight versus not enough oversight?
I think different people will give you a different answer to this. So I'm going to try to give you multiple answers. One visual is like the trapeze artist practicing with the net below them. Your relationship with a worker should be that you are the net, right? Or your systems are like your systems are the trapeze and you are the net would probably be a way to do it, right? They need something to hold on to that they can trust, and you need to be there when those things fail. That's the relationship. And they need distance, right? They can't swing on a trapeze if their feet are dragging on the neck. So you need to get on the net. So you need to give them distance, right? Um, but other people might want to visualize it more like a pulsing, right? Like an information collapse and pulsing, where people come together for moments to integrate and share thoughts, and then they pulse out, and it's like almost like a trampoline bounce, right? And you are the systems and you are both the trampoline at the same time, that kind of thing, where people need a frequency of contact where they feel support, that they know you're there, right? They need to remember that you're there. So as as they go up and down in their workday, they know that you're always there, but they need enough freedom to really learn who they are in the role and to develop their own unique thoughts. Because um, if you don't have people having their own interpretations and own unique thoughts, then nobody brings anything new to the company. For example, when I first started hiring salespeople outside of the newspaper industry, I would not train them intentionally for the first 2 weeks and say, "This is what we sell. It's a decent sale. It's pretty easy compared to what you sold before. Somebody sold cars or furniture or finance or whatever." And I'd say, go out to the field with another person and kind of do your thing. See if you can come up with some cool ways that you think that this could be sold, and let's have a post like onboarding scrimmage, and then I'll train you the way that we do it once you've got your own ideas. And the amount of innovation that came from letting other salespeople that have already been trained on sales in a different industry come and bring those best practices to the newspaper industry, they would bring uh, just some really cool stuff that we never thought would apply. And they applied it in our world, and we would then increase our knowledge base. But too many owners think that they are the last stop, right? That they are the big shot, right? And that will kill your company's potential for innovation. Every single person in a company can gift like IP at one point, at any moment in time. And so I think that's an important part of running a business is you need to give people the distance to become themselves, and that way they can apply themselves to the business. But you then, again, with the pulse analogy, there needs to be a frequency of contact, and depending on the quality of contact, the frequency then matters too. And there can be another cautionary tale about wasting people's time, unnecessary meetings. So in my world of housekeeping, I'm training a new student right now who lives in Colombia, like Medellin, and he has a portfolio in Cleveland, and he's hiring housekeepers in house for the very first time, not using contractors. And he's trying to identify like the best way to have a relationship with these housekeepers. And so instead of just getting on the phone or texting them what their schedules are, I'm telling him to randomly have little FaceTime sessions with them, where those FaceTime sessions will sometimes just be hello, but sometimes those FaceTime sessions will be inspections of the listing, right? But he needs to make sure that his conversations with the team aren't always just, we need you to do this, this, and this. Um, Another student of mine said, I'm having a hard time with a housekeeper retention. I don't know what's going on. What XYZ? I'm like, well, who was the last person that like left your company? Like you said that they just left after 3 weeks. Who's the last person? And they gave me a few like really weird, like, well, circumstantially it was this and this. I'm like, well, no, what was the first failure? You just complained about somebody leaving, like a fresh hire leaving after 3 weeks. Who was that person? And he was like, that was like a month ago. I was like, what was that person's name? They had a hard time remembering the person's name. I'm like, how many kids does that person have? What kind of car did they drive? Where did they grow up? Um, what's their favorite color? What's their favorite food? Tell me about this person. And they could not answer a single one of many questions. They had zero relationship with this worker. And of course, my final assessment was the reason why people are leaving is you don't care about your people. You're not having 5-minute conversations with people unnecessarily to get to know them. If anything ever took 5 minutes, it's only because it took you 5 minutes to explain your expectations of them that day. You've had zero conversations to get to know them, why they're working, what their goals are, what their fears are. And to leverage somebody and to actually get a good return on investment, you absolutely need to care about your people. Otherwise, yeah, they disengage and they leave.
Hmm. I love that. That's and I love the visual examples too that you shared. So thanks for that. I want to touch on two concepts here that you just mentioned one of them, and in previous conversations I heard you talk about another one, which are gravity and inertia in the context of business and scaling an operation. How do you think about those two, you know, words right there, inertia and gravity, and what does it mean to have, scale gravity pulling you downwards versus inertia in terms of when you're trying to do something and trying to break through a certain barrier of scalability. Like what do these two words mean to you, and how do you apply them in the context of scaling a vacation rental portfolio?
Well, inertia is probably the fun one, right? Inertia is my favorite. Things don't exist until you make them exist, right? And so that go to market concept of force, sometimes we have to force something into existence, and that the inertia of creation is big, right? You have to create a belief system. There's a book called All Marketers Are Liars by Seth Godin, and he talks about how the best marketers won't tell you something, they'll show you something that makes you tell yourself a story. Like Coca-Cola uses the color red, and they don't tell you why, but they believe the color red makes you make some certain beliefs. McDonald's red and yellow to increase your appetite. This company called Kiehl's makeup brand would put a Harley Davidson on the floor of the makeup store and a stunt plane hanging from the ceiling to make you think it was owned by a male potentially, but it's always been an Estee Lauder brand. They show you things that make you tell yourself a story. And you need to show people with enough consistency and enough conviction something that they then tell themselves something, and you can create a belief. Really cool stuff. So the inertia of creating belief is about actually saturating the populace with. I think they say about 10%. You need about 10% saturation with the belief for it to be able to start to take a hold in a community of people where they all can start to talk about it, and then the belief can become real. But to get to that point, um, your beliefs that you're trying to thrust upon somebody also are conflicting with other beliefs. People already believe stuff, right? Unless it's a blue ocean concept. Um, which is like actually how to brainwash somebody is to just be the first person to tell them about something, right? So if you didn't know um, the definition of a certain word, and I told you the definition of a certain word, and it sat in your head long enough, 2 years from now, you're going to actually just believe that that word means something that it doesn't because I told you first, right? But there's very little new now. So to thrust an idea upon somebody or a change of ideology, there needs to be a saturation. And um, every process has inertia, right? I guess is if we boil this down to its most basic parts. Every process has inertia. If a housekeeper is going to go clean an apartment, there's a level of inertia there. They actually have to put in effort. That effort, the calories burned is inertia. If a machine has a throughput, there's going to be inertia. There's going to be friction. If something's pushed across the floor, there's inertia, right? This concept of inertia is there's always a cost, right? There's always an exchange. And that exchange has inherent resistance because there's always something lost whenever you try to accomplish anything. Um, and that it could be just very much energy, like actual literal energy in the process of doing something, or it could be the loss of like motivation, like somebody actually puts in their own effort, right? Um, so uh, with apartment listings, right? We this concept of inertia can go to listing quality with a property. The better your property, the nicer the property, the more the positive effect it has on a customer, the better experience that they're going to have. But if you have a listing that has issues, like there's issues with the internet, or the front stoop isn't cleaned, or the key doesn't work upon entry, or there's these issues upon arrival, that starts to breed neuroticism in your guests because guests are nervous travelers. And the less confidence a guest has during their stay, the more problems that they're going to give you back. So the more inertia that a guest has upon arrival, which inertia will be things that are below their expectation or things that are unplanned for, the more inertia that that guest gives you back in managing your business through the amount of hours of customer support you have to give them, dealing with like resolutions or stuff like that. And so properties that have problems can cost 10x the workload of a luxury property that has no problems. So you can have one good property that has no issues because it's nice, that makes you $10,000 a month. And you could have 10 properties that only make you $500 a month and they're kind of grungy. And the workload on those 10 properties is like 20 or 30 times as much as the one house that makes you 10,000. So the concept of inertia can apply to property quality and the consequences of guests not getting what they ask for. Um, then this can actually expand into reputation inertia too. Apple had the same issue when there's that phone that bent when people sat down. Remember that new phone where the phone would bend, right? That created all sorts of brand related inertia. And I don't know if they had to recreate the phone or whatnot, but I just remember the amount of kickback on social media for the like. I don't know if they called it Bendigate or something like that, but that was substantially negative for the brand, and I imagine their stock actually underperformed for a period of time due to a drop of sentiment. That's another example.
I love that. And when you talk about saturation in the context of trying to fight back against inertia to make sure that an idea is adopted, uh, or whatnot, what would you say is the equivalent of saturation, but in the context of trying to fight back against inertia of scale, right? Because you talk about inertia of scale, and what I understood from that was basically like, as you get bigger and bigger, there will be things that if left to their own devices will be working against you, type of thing, right? So unless you do something to fight back that inertia, of scale, you'll end up going under. So what are those things that happen, when you're scaling, that you would consider to be the inertia of scale, and what's the equivalent of saturation in terms of trying to fight back with
Yeah,
that inertia of scale?
sure. So this concept of atrophy, really, right? I think is what you're discussing, which might actually even be a law of thermodynamics, right? That everything breaks down eventually, down to its most basic elements, back down into chaos or whatever. So atrophy applies in so many different industries. In my world of rental arbitrage, a lease will end, and that lease may not renew. For example, if I convince a landlord to rent to me, I get the property for term, but I may not get a term renewal. And so if I have 100 properties and I only get a 90% renewal, I will lose 10 properties a year. I have a 10% rate of like atrophy on my doors. But also furniture has an atrophy. Heavy equipment. If you have bulldozers or if you have like servers, everything atrophies at one point. As things get used, they break down. So there's maintenance there. So atrophy could be that you need a number of sales agents to continue to sign up new customers to beat the drop in memberships, which newspapers had to deal with the atrophy of drop of memberships. So a sales force to increase their consumer base as they lose consumers through aging out, death, disinterest. That would be a form of fighting against the atrophy, right? Which is the kind of like the inertia that you're talking about. Maintenance of heavy equipment, it would be a form of fighting against that same atrophy. Sales agents to sign up new doors as we get non-renewals on leases would be a way to fight against that same atrophy. Um, with customers going back to hotels is a form of atrophy that Airbnb has to deal with right now, and hotels are putting a lot of money in trying to claw back customers from Airbnb back to hotels by claiming that hotels are like more consistent, for example. And these and so in order for Airbnb to beat hotels, they need to find a fresh way to communicate why Airbnbs are relevant, right? If hotels have their new countermeasure against Airbnb, well, Airbnb needs a new countermeasure again against hotels to say, well, who cares what hotels are saying now? Airbnb is still better for this other new reason. And so now Airbnb is pushing categories, right? Like tree houses and yurts and castles and farms and experiences that hotels could never compete with, listings that have a lot of size, a lot of nuance, a lot of novelty. And that's Airbnb's now their push against the inevitability of hotels trying to claw back that market share. So inertia at scale is really like when you build a structure, the bigger the structure, the heavier the structure, the more support beams it needs, for example, right? And so you also need more specialists at scale, is I guess what I'm going to get at here, right? So for scale, when we have 100 listings, not only do we need just some housekeepers, but those housekeepers need managers. And we might need a couple specialized inspectors to make sure that homes are actually properly cleaned appropriately enough. And we'll need dedicated maintenance guys and stuff like that. Where when you're small and you have just like one or two properties, you might need a maintenance guy once every 3 or 5 weeks, right? And so you just call somebody on TaskRabbit. But at scale, you have you have such a consistent need, and every exposure to that need presents its own risks. So at that point, you can't affordably hire somebody trustworthy every single day at $75 an hour. You need to find a way to get dedicated access to somebody who also risk mitigates like a $75 an hour professional, but at a cost that doesn't break the bank. And we do this with housekeepers, customer service staff, maintenance people, revenue analysts, stuff like that. All of these specialized positions are like how architecture gets more complex as the building gets larger. You need more specialized roles to support the weight of increased need in a category of the business. Like human resources, every company in any industry, as it gets bigger, has a dedicated human resources department. And any company that gets big enough also has a dedicated chief of staff above that at one point. As you get bigger, you need more specialization.
Hmm. Interesting. You've also talked a lot about throughput here. So if we think of the machine of a vacation rental portfolio, and we're trying to think of the different levers that you can play with to try to increase or maximize throughput, you can increase the number of properties or doors that you have, the inventory that you either do arbitrage with or manage, and the number of nights that those are available. Those seem to me like the most obvious levers that you can play with. What other levers do you think of to try to maximize throughput in the machine of your arbitrage portfolio?
So a property has a few processes, right? It has the guest arrival process. It has the hosting process, which is guests staying for however many number of days, the checkout process, and the turnover process. Probably those are the four processes. It has a project, which is launch, right? But launch is not operations. If you launch properties every single week, your launch team could be considered operations. But for the sake of one listing, it's a project. So you get your listing up and launched, ready for market, pretty photos, whatever. Guest finds it on Airbnb and starts sending some messages, right? The conversation with that guest through the decision to book and them getting their check-in guide and them arriving is one process, right? And that process can then be centralized. You'll have one centralized team that can talk and support all properties across the country or world with one centralized support department, right? That could be a way to optimize your levers, right? Now you also have technology there, keyless entry, but every keyless entry should probably have a low tech backup just in case it breaks. And there's other levers there, right? Then the hosting process, guest support during the time that they're there, making sure that they enjoy their stay, that everything's working, like whatever. That's the lightest part of the business, and that can actually still be handled by the guest arrival team usually. Until you hit some really high point of scale, we have something we call firefighters. Firefighters are people that are in any market, boots on the ground, that can show up to a property and solve a problem if there is one. And so at scale, the concept of a firefighter is that when somebody has arrived, there will inevitably be things like toilet paper's missing, plumbing issue, key doesn't work, something. There's the smoke alarm is chirping and people are upset about that. A firefighter goes wherever they are needed regionally to do whatever has to get done right now, right? So mid the mid stay lever is a firefighter, I think is probably the thing that we've done at scale. Checkout. Checkout includes um, overstays when people aren't leaving. It includes damage, missing items, wellness checks, resolutions for like payments and stuff like that. Right. So checkout has an inspection process to make sure that the home is still in fighting shape for the next guest, bills guests for any damages undeclared before they leave, and handles any issues with the guest's departure process. And then also reviews, trying to get that guest to leave a positive review. The big thing that we did to kind of like lever or to leverage scale for checkouts was to have a guest experience manager that believes everything that a guest says is true. So when a guest was upset about something and they wanted a refund, we would just like actually go to bat against operations on their behalf so they felt represented. And that allowed us to get more five-star reviews because when they talked to our company, they didn't just talk to operations that told them to go take a hike because something wasn't in our budget. They would talk to the guest experience manager or the guest experience team, and that team would go, "Yeah, we believe you, whatever you need. Let me go talk to operations. Let me go talk to management, see what I can get you." And the fact that we had an advocate made guest sentiment higher, which increased our five-star review percentage. And that was a part of our checkout process was we're planning ahead. We needed five-star reviews. How could we make sure that we had the best guest sentiment on that way out? And then, of course, the turnover process. The housekeeping team does a lot of that listing checkup stuff for checkout, like the stolen, damaged, missing item stuff that then the resolutions team takes over. But then I think the biggest process that has the most opportunity for leverage is the housekeeping part, right? Having your own housekeepers, buy a laundromat at one point. If you got 200 doors in a city, you should own a laundromat, for example. Um, because washer and dryer, they have their own throughput, right? They can do a load of laundry in a certain period of time. And if you got 80 loads of laundry to do on a weekend, how are you going to get 80 loads of laundry done, right? You could have 12 housekeepers doing all the laundry at these houses, but at one point, there's just this level of complexity that can only be solved by offloading laundry and doing laundry at scale offsite. So, hiring your own housekeepers, having your own recruitment protocols, buying a laundromat at one point, and really like optimizing your own SOPs for your housekeepers, and of course, getting them to buy in. Out of all the people in the company that need to really soak in a culture and believe that their job means something, it's definitely the housekeepers.
Mm, that's interesting. Now let's talk a little bit about direct bookings. So when do you recommend someone to start thinking about driving direct bookings, or start to put together a direct booking strategy, versus when do you tell them to just basically do the best they can on one OTA, be it Airbnb or whatever other OTA? Because there's a lot of a talk, and I feel like people are kind of in one of two extremes. They either think, okay, let's just be the best in the OTAs, I'm just gonna play by their rules. I don't want to have blocks in those calendars that are gonna affect my positioning. And then there's those that are on the extreme of like I Airbnb is not my friend. I actually need to be protecting my business by driving direct bookings. Otherwise, I'm basically at risk of disappearing, just from a change in policy of Airbnb or whatever that might be. How do you think through those two extremes, and when do you recommend people start looking at direct bookings?
Well, when you look at the evolution of a business like a hotel, hotels never needed Airbnb, right? They existed long before it. And a host is endeavoring to be just like a hotel eventually, right? To not need Airbnb at all. But the reason why so many people are in this space is because Airbnb has found a way to simplify away all the complexities. Remember that story I told you about when I started hiring salespeople to sell newspaper subscriptions and I handled locations and sales pitch and all this stuff for them? and they got $40 and I got 100, you know? Airbnb has done the same thing. Airbnb has handled all of the complexities of the space all the way down to what they call their air cover, which Verbo has the same, right? Verbo has a guarantee too, but they've taken the risk away to some degree. They've taken distribution and marketing away to some degree. They've made the software a a tool where hosts can have a listing look good enough to get a booking. And so this concept of creating a sticky product that people don't leave, very much like Apple would, is that Airbnb has supplied enterprise level solutions to the individual. They've given hotel level tools and widgets to the little guy. And that's why people stay with Airbnb. So when you're first new, there's no hate on doing Airbnb and then doing Verbo maybe. Airbnb, Verbo are the two safest and largest channels. Booking.com is big, but there's this issue with their payments where if you get on Booking, they'll block your calendar. Somebody won't stay because they blocked the calendar, and you're supposed to collect payment on site, but they never stay and they never pay. And then Booking.com wants you to pay a commission for somebody that never showed up. And most hosts don't understand how Booking works and end up in this spot where they owe Booking.com money for like what seems to be no reason. So don't get on Booking.com unless you can activate something called payments by Booking. Once you configure payments by Booking out, then yeah, be on Booking.com. And between the three, you'll notice that you'll have a combination of like Verbo Airbnb or Booking.com Airbnb or something. And at that point, you're multi-channel. You're still not going direct, but this whole time you could be planning for direct by capturing data. And there's a company called StayFi that has this Wi-Fi access portal where you have to give your email to access the Wi-Fi. It's one of the easiest ways to start collecting emails, and then you can start an email campaign later. You don't even need a direct booking website. You can still use emails to drive people back to your Airbnb or Vrbo listings. But the moment you're multi-channel, you're probably going to sign up for a channel manager that also gives you a direct booking website, so you could use an email campaign to push them back into it. But you can collect emails for like a solid year and then go direct eventually. There's no rush. And the more emails you get, the more robust data you have to then, if you ever did an ad campaign, you can actually put those all into a table and you can have an ad run a very elegant system that targets people just like the people that have stayed. So you don't need to go direct even for years. I did Airbnb only until I broke 100 doors, only Airbnb, just to prove that you could. I don't recommend it, but you could do that. And as long as you're collecting customer data, the data is really what you need. And as soon as you go
Mhm.
direct, you just need to make sure you have a good, robust amount of data to start your email campaign and a direct booking website that's not glitchy. And most everybody's direct booking website is just fine.
Mhm. So let's say you hit that 100 property mark, and now you start thinking, okay, I'm gonna go and start to use this, these contacts that I've collected throughout the years. I'm gonna start now promoting to them. Now, I want to hear your thoughts on the following, which is, as a business, right? At that point, you have a certain, let's say, budget for marketing, right? This is how much you can invest in your marketing initiatives, whatever that is. Now, you can choose to try to invest in marketing related to growing your inventory, right? Which in your case would be trying to reach more, I don't know, landowners, landlords, to try to pitch them, your arbitrage model and whatnot. In the case of a co-host or a management company, it's, homeowner acquisition, right? Trying to get to more homeowners. Or you can, invest that money into trying to drive traffic to your direct booking website and whatnot. How do you think about where to put your resources in terms of homeowner acquisition or inventory acquisition versus guest, marketing? What do you see as most valuable, and how do you make that allocation of limited resources?
So I would like to answer this question, but I'd like to take the word money out. Resources was great. And resources doesn't necessarily mean money, but time and study, right? Time, study, expertise, resources. I don't think people should be throwing money at things, by the way. So that's why I'm taking the money part out of your question. And there's a third one, which is property upkeep and quality of service, right? I think the very first thing somebody should do is play a great defensive game where they make sure that there is not that atrophy that we discussed in a listing. The furniture is
Mhm.
still good. The walls are getting repainted because there's going to get scuffs from furniture. The vents are getting cleaned. Air filters are getting replaced. Batteries are like all that stuff, right? We need to make sure that we defend our current listings and that they perform well for a long time. That's number one. From there, we should be adding more doors because economies of scale um, give us more profit, more cash flow, right? And by the time we go direct, we need to have enough doors to get a good return on our spend. If we do have an ad spend, because if we have an ad spend for 2 properties, that property better be a 14-bedroom mansion that could get $4,000 a night or better. If we're going to do an ad campaign for one property, it better be a monster of a property. If we're trying to do an ad spend to fill up apartments or 3-bedroom homes, we need more volume, right? We need to know that our ad could whack 5 customers and we can serve all 5. Otherwise, we just have an inefficiency in the spend there. So we need scale before we need external marketing, is what I think. And I don't think you should spend money on ads. Not nearly early on enough. Everything needs to be built from the bottom of the funnel up, right? You would need, that's why I said defend your product first. You need a good deliverable product. And then you need a good final mile um, architecture for the final mile of decision making, right? So like your website, and halfway down the website where people are starting to, like, after they click your first call to action, right? After they click the first call to action, everything from there needs to be built to perfection too, right? So not just your landing page, but after somebody clicks the call to action button on your landing page, where do they go from there? And when they get their booking, that needs to be built to perfection first. Because if you have a weak point at the bottom or middle of your funnel, you can blow millions of dollars on top of funnel ad spend, and no one will get to the bottom of the funnel because the funnel's broken. You got a leaky funnel. So, first, product, defend your product. Second, build your final mile architecture. I made that phrase up. No one, you don't Google search final mile decision making or whatever. I'm making this up. It's an internal thing. Then you can work on your like middle of funnel landing page, social media, and people might disagree with me saying this, but your static social media is middle funnel. New content is top of funnel. It's a weird way to put this, but when somebody sees a piece of content from you, that's when they first learn who you are. People will then investigate you across multiple channels. They'll look at your Twitter, your Instagram, your YouTube, your Etsy, whatever. They'll try to find you everywhere when they're looking you up. And all of these other channels now become middle of funnel. They actually drive trust for any future decisions. So you'll have middle of funnel content like your website, your blogs, interviews, podcasts like this. Somebody might see me do some trendy skit where I'm like, I might be in a French maid outfit cleaning and do a TikTok video like making fun of myself cleaning like a French maid. And somebody might find me from some comical content about Airbnb and then find this podcast, right? For example, right? So now this is actually middle of funnel. It's value rich, it's long form, it's whatever. And so to take this tangent and to finally compress it into one thought, spend your money on your bottom of funnel and then build it from the back to the front, and then only once you have great performance data from the middle of the funnel down, then you can spend money on top of funnel. And you should not actually spend money on top of funnel until you really learn what that takes. And so, for example, sign up for email campaigns from all of your competitors, right? Everybody who could ever, like Saunders, Stay Alfred, who's gone now, but you know what I mean, Marriott, Hilton, whoever, sign up for emails into one email like account, one bucket. Then start to go through those and see the ones that you think are favorites, and save those into a note file. And then take that note file of, say, 100 different emails, give it to ChatGPT Plus and say, these are 100 of my favorite emails from my competition. I want to create an email campaign. I want you to reference this document forever as I ask you to build me one email at a time. And it's going to then use and say, I want you to make me a 10 email welcome drip where I want an email sequence of 10 emails. Whenever somebody joins my email list, I want 10 emails that are high value, high open rate, trust building, where we don't really ask them to do much. We just want to give them value. That's brand congruent. Help me build those 10 emails. And then ChatGPT can build you your email content, right? And then you can hand that stuff off to a content person at one point when you want to level that up. But knowing how to work with ChatGPT and how to steal other people's ideas, that's one example of creating a drip. And then you can go back to ChatGPT with the same 100 emails and go, hey, I want to do a holiday campaign where I'm trying to drive people to book my property. So I want to do 3 emails that is a combination of value, sensationalism, and a call to action with some urgency that all of our holiday dates are getting booked up. Help me build 3 emails. And that you don't have to spend a ton of money on an email company for that. You just have to steal from the people who've already spent millions of dollars. Think of CVS. Anytime a Walgreens gets built, a CVS gets built across the street because Walgreens spent the money on market research and CVS just knows that Walgreens spent the money on market research. they're saving all that money on R&D and just building in their competitor's backyard. So do the same thing. If Hilton is spending $400,000 $500,000 on a few different experts that do emails, just steal all of Hilton's emails and rebrand them in some way using ChatGPT.
Yeah. I love that. I love that, Sean. And I want to end this on a macro question, because we started the podcast by talking about the increase of supply and how there's more and more competition, hence the need to differentiate yourself through design. But I want to hear your thoughts on the following, which is, I was watching a webinar from Key Data that was talking about how when you look at the per unit performance, post COVID in the market, there's a lot of sort of properties that are let's say underperforming last year, because we know that right after COVID there was a boom in demand in certain markets, which led to a lot of crazy numbers, crazy results. Whereas now that we're normalizing ourselves, and there's also the fact that supply outgrew demand in a lot of cases. The per unit results in many cases look down versus previous years, but the portfolio revenues of operators still are up, right? They're still up, year over year, primarily because they've added more inventory. And the same seems to be the case, if in the case of Airbnb, right? They're showing better performance in their earnings, but not on a per unit level, but rather on a portfolio company level, because they've continued to add more and more inventory. So here's the question to you: if we could say that this decrease in per property performance comes from that sort of increase in inventory that came faster than the increase in demand, what will need to happen from a macro point of view for us to see that shift, backwards, so to speak? So, in other words, I don't think supply is slowing down. I don't think there's going to be less supply coming into the market. So, therefore, do we need to see a massive, increase in guest demand just to balance out that rapid and almost acceleratory increase in supply, or what you foresee from a macro perspective, that will shift this trend of per unit performance looking worse and worse year after year?
Yeah, this is fun. So you said in a lot of cases, and we have to come back to that phrase because that's a key phrase for this argument or this conversation. But you just described the bubble. Everything's growing. There's more listing volume, right? But the quality of profit has gone down. So if a portfolio had 20% profit, like net operating income, or something like after cost of sale or something, say it's 20%. But now, even though they made more total gross money, their total profit's only 11%. That shrinking margin is actually very scary. Who cares if they have double the inventory? Now they have double the exposure at half of the margin, which means that their risk profile is probably like, if somebody, I'm not a professional analyst in the world of risk, but I can tell you that having double the inventory at half of its profitability is more than double the risk. It's more than double, right? It might be quadruple if you compound it. Somebody in the comments of this video, if there's going to be a comments section, I'd love somebody who knows risk to be able to tell me what that actually means. But it's bad. There will be a bottom falling out, and there already has been. One of my students, who's now a coach in Cracking Superhost, saw in one of his cities in California that last year there was a 20% deflation of supply in 3 months, from February through May. After slow season, there's a 20% deflation of supply because people quit, because there wasn't enough money there to justify staying. People aren't going to stay when there's when there's a deflation of margin. So if listings across the world are experiencing a deflation of margin, there will be people who give up, because if the average margin goes from 20 to 11%, what happened to the people whose margins were 5% before the deflation? They might be negative 5%, and they can only hold on so long. So we absolutely will see a washing out of listings if the margins have constrained or compressed or whatever, you want to use, what word you want. So We will see a natural correction. I actually think we're already settling into a natural correction in a lot of cases, which we're going to get to. Um, and the reason why we're seeing this too is because some markets had a real sustained increase of transient traffic, but some only had a circumstantial increase because of revenge travel, right? So COVID locked people up into their homes, and then people wanted to get out. So people started to vacation more. They did more staycations. They went to cabins nearby. They went more rural, whatever. But those sentiments changed because those sentiments were reactionary to a black swan event. And so people who bought houses to try to capture inventory on what was a fad or a very short term trend on where people wanted to go, they're getting their heads taken off because they bought log cabins in areas that people don't actually want to go anymore. They only went because they were locked up for COVID, right? So, when we do market research, we have to ask ourselves, what is the nature of this growth? Is it sustainable? And people and optimism, like they kind of have this married relationship where they go, oh, this market's in an uptrend, it's always going to be in an uptrend, right? If you see people who are like forever bulls in the market, they never think that there's ever going to be a recession, right? And this happens when people do market research too. They get all this greed and these stars in their eyes, and they pick up properties in speculative markets that are doing well, but they don't actually know why they're doing well. So when you do your homework on where we want to pick up the next property, we want to look for places that have a sustained reason, like an argument for sustained growth, right? Where the increase wasn't because of something like a fad, or we want to get ahead of it, actually. You can actually get in front of these trends and pick up properties before the boom happens, but also know that you're only going to be there for 2 or 3 years and then you're going to get out of the way, right? I call this blitzing in my program. We find places where hotels don't exist yet because hotels would never have built. But then there's neighborhoods that are up and coming. I did it in East Downtown Houston, Bishop Arts Dallas, Fishtown, Northern Liberties, Philadelphia, and Wynwood in Miami. There's areas where hotels weren't there because it wasn't cool yet. But as soon as something is cool, people want to be there. You can put Airbnbs there before there's hotels and make a killing until hotels get there at bare minimum. So there's going to be constant like ebbs and flows in this industry. The cycle's much faster than real estate, and the reason why people make money in Airbnb will be for multiple reasons. The need to get out and travel staycations was just one, but with the new election, we might see that people move in and out of states. Right. So certain cities might have just huge boom of growth because people don't want to be in a certain city anymore because of the politics. And because of that, now the amount of hotel doors that exist in that new city can't support the new base size of the populace. So we'll need more Airbnb keys until the hotels could keep catch up, right? Until there's new growth. So politics can drive it, like a pandemic can drive it. Somebody just might make the right TikTok video about some cute little city, and then all of a sudden people are going to go there for a while. Fracking made Midland, Odessa boom, and anybody who did Airbnb in Midland, Odessa was charging $1,000 a night for these houses because there's just no hotel inventory. We need to have a robust like outlook. We need to be looking for multiple reasons why properties can perform, but also be objective enough to know that what we might find might just be lightning in the bottle, and we might make $1 million one year in one market, but we have to get out next year.
Wow, that's a very interesting perspective. Thank you so much, Sean. This has been great. I could keep you here for hours. Believe me, I could. But
It'd be fun.
yeah, we have to wrap it up at some point. So this is the time to do so. Thank you so much for your generosity, for your time. This has been super fun, super insightful, and hopefully for the audience as well. So
Yeah.
yeah, thanks so much for taking the time, Sean.
Yeah. Thank you for having me.
All right.
All right, everybody. I'll see you.